Welcome, everyone. My name is Jacqueline Stryker. As the co-chair of the Services to Artists Committee, I'm pleased to welcome you to the 2022 Annual Artist Interviews, one of the highlights of the CAA conference. This year's talks are with Jessica Stockholder and Willie Cole. SAC sessions are free and open to the public and provide opportunities for the creative exchange of ideas. I'd like to first take a moment to acknowledge that every community owes existence and vitality to generations from around the world who contributed their hopes, dreams, and energy to making the history that led to this moment. In this virtual space, I invite you to add into the chat the ancestral lands you are currently standing on. I am joining you from Brooklyn, New York, and I am on Munsee Lenape land. We thank them for their stewardship of the land. While most of you are likely not new to Zoom, I wanted to point out that captioning is available for this session. Simply click on the closed captioning box at the bottom of your screen. Also in Zoom, you can raise your hand by clicking to the reactions or participants tab. And now I'm delighted to introduce to you our first distinguished artist whose work I've long admired, Jessica Stockholder. Jessica Stockholder is an internationally acclaimed visual artist and educator who lives and works in Chicago. Her work sits at the intersection of painting with sculpture and often incorporates the architecture in which it has been conceived, employing a wide range of ordinary everyday materials. Stockholder orchestrates an intersection of pictorial and physical space. She probes how meaning derives from physicality and engages the sensuality and pleasure evoked by color and formal order in an effort to call attention to the edges of understanding. Her work has been exhibited in many of the world's most influential art venues, including the Dia Center for the Arts, the Whitney Museum of American Art, and the Venice Biennale. It's included in such museum collections as the Art Institute of Chicago, the Whitney Museum of American Art, LACMA, and the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam. Stockholder is currently the Raymond W. and Martha Hilpert Gruner Distinguished Service Professor in the Department of Visual Arts at the University of Chicago. She's being interviewed by Christine Mehring, who is the Mary L. Block Professor of Art History at the University of Chicago. Christine Mehring works on modern and contemporary art. Her research, writing, and teaching focus on abstraction, particularly the ways in which non-mimetic forms, colors, and non-traditional materials come to signify in relation to specific historical contexts. I'm really looking forward to this conversation, as I'm sure all of you are. And now, without further ado, Jessica Stockholder and Christine Mehring.
Hi.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Jessica.
Hi, Christine. So thank you, Jacqueline, for that really lovely introduction. And thanks to everybody at CAA who organized this. And thank you for the invitation to be here. It's really a nice privilege to talk about the work. And also to you, Christine, for agreeing to be my interlocutor. Christine and I both work at UChicago, and Christine is a really valued colleague as well as a friend, very good friend.
Well, it's an honor to be here, Jessica, always to talk with you.
So we thought that I would start by sharing, I'm going to share my screen. So I thought to quickly go through some work and 4 different kind of groups of work that I've made in the recent past. And just to talk about conceptually and what I'm thinking about in these different groups of work as a way to frame my conversation with Christine. So the first group of work is loosely called curating, where I've been invited on a few different occasions to act as a curator. And for me, that process is very related to the way in which I work internally to my work, where I work with lots of different objects. So as a curator, I'm working, in this case, this was an invitation from the Centraal Museum in Utrecht, 2019, I think this show was. And they invited me to intersect their collection and orchestrate an exhibition that in a way that I wanted to. So this show opens with this work in the, can you see my cursor when I'm moving it around? Does that work? Good. This work is an assist, 3 squared at half scale from 2018, and it's tied to a sculpture from the cathedral in Utrecht. And that sculpture is a prop. The work doesn't stand on its own. I'll come back to that and show you some more assists. All of my work all these groups of work are, I think, a kind of thread question running through is about the relationship of edge and boundary. So I'm always interested in how the work I'm making meets where it is. So in this exhibition, I've paired my work with various works in the museum. And there's an installation, what I call an installation work, in the middle of the show. And this scaffolding stair takes you to look inside the room where the installation is, called In the Face of Drifting Eye. So this is the floor underneath the floor above that the scaffolding takes you to. The mirror here is from the collection of the museum. This is upstairs, many mirrors from the collection. This mirror that I painted on isn't from the collection. This painting isn't from the collection. It's from a thrift store in the neighborhood. So questions about the edge between what's in a collection, how things are valued. I could never put paint on something in the collection. And then the mirrors, as you move through, are reflecting different parts of the building. So in this mirror here, you're looking through another cut in the wall, and in that mirror too. And you can look out of that cut to see the rest of the exhibition. This is the other side. It's a kind of meandering space that one can move through many rooms. This is another assist, very similar to the one that I started with. It's identical, except that it's twice as big. Assist 3 squared from the riverbank, strapped to a piece of furniture from the collection of the Central Museum. Their collection is a big kind of rambling collection, including furniture, design, painting, sculpture, history, and contemporary work. This is the next room, Rietveld shells from the 50s and 60s. There's an Edmund de Waal sculpture, 2 kind of fish tank-like things on the Rietveld shelf. He very generously made those for the exhibition. They're not in the collection of the museum. There were just a few things we asked for outside of the collection. Then these are tables and a bench with one of my sculptures on one of the tables. So the whole question of framing and pedestal is always central to my work, which the pedestal and the frame contribute to the edges of the work in question. There's the work of mine on a table that is thought to be the table that a peace treaty was signed on in Utrecht. And then I did a show in Turin in 2021, well, during lockdown, so I actually didn't get to be there. But this is a floor plan for the installation of the show. Again, I was invited. It was at OGR in Turin. They don't have their own collection. I was invited to work with 2 collections, one from La Caixa in Barcelona, and the other a bank collection in Turin. And the show was called Cut a Rug. I've just put many people's work was in the show. I put everybody's names on the bottom here, but this is how you enter. The space had very little lighting. It had no internal architecture. It was a raw space. So I designed these kind of triangular shaped structures that made for walls, and also the floor covering. So there's again a kind of blurry line between what's my work and what the work, I mean, my effort was to present the works from these collections, honoring the artists whose work I was showing. I wasn't using their work in the way that I use things inside of one of my works. But at the same time, this is kind of like a wrestling ring kind of a fake one that's there that you can stand on and see the rest of the show. This is my sculpture that was produced for the show, that I'm sort of circling my mouse over. And you can see that there are artists from all over the place. So I just want to quickly move through that. And then this is a section about the assists. If you see one of my assists, you wouldn't know unless I told you that the work, like in this case, the washing machine is not part of the sculpture. The washing machine is a prop for the sculpture. This is the same, oh, I made a mistake there. That was supposed to be another prop, but sorry about that. And then I thought to just give you a sense of how I make them. This is a model for that assist, made with some off-the-shelf things from Home Depot, and then bent pieces of flashing and paper. And in this case, I worked with a metal worker who fabricated it for me. And this one is made more in the same fashion that I make stuff generally in my studio. So this is made from metal studs, copper bowl, fabric, hardware, cords. So I work with all kinds of materials, treating them a little bit as one treats paint. This is another assist that was fabricated with a model. And there it is at half scale, hinged to another prop. This is called Flagged and Down, made in my studio and attached to a stool. And this is in a show that was called Relational Aesthetics in Austin. And you can see Flagged and Down is here attached to a motorbike that somebody at the museum lent for the occasion. And this is another work from my studio, Rounding the Corner. It doesn't involve an assist. And this is an assist that was in Utrecht, accompanying my show there. And this particular assist is strapped to two art objects. One by Paul Kingma, who's the sculpture in the foreground there, and the other by Hans Wimmer, the horse. And this was a temporary installation of the work. I don't think it would be appropriate to use other people's artworks in a permanent way, but it was temporary, and neither of these artists is still living. They're both sculptures are in the collection of the city of Utrecht. And this is the more recent things I've been working on, which I'm calling specific shapes and fixed objects. And the fixed object is an unchanging thing that I make in the studio. And it's paired with the specific shape, which is made from a drawing. And this is a drawing for that piece that's then projected onto the wall. And it can, the shape can be at different scales. Of course, the object is fixed, doesn't shift shape or change scale, but this can be at different scales, and I don't ask anyone to suffer over the angle of the projector, so the exact nature of the shape can change. I specify a color, and this is a drawing for the specific shape that has a color, and then there's a couple of Pantone colors there. So I ask people to try and match the color. But color is something that always changes anyway, with different kinds of light on it, and in relationship to other colors. The color of the floor alters what the color on the wall looks like. So the works are about the relationship of a kind of concrete material, fixed quality of stuff in our world, and in relationship to our experience of that stuff, and also abstraction, the way in which everything we see is informed by the structure of our thought. And my work altogether is about the collision between those things, or also maybe another way to say that would be to say the way in which our abstract thought and thinking and understanding grow from and are rooted in our concrete experience of the world. This is in my studio now, 2 new ones. And then this last little body of work is, I call it e-waste work, where I took a lot of e-waste, old computer parts and CPU units and things and printers, painted on them and paired them with mostly with photographic work that's printed on cloth. And I was interested in the e-waste because they are all mass-produced objects. If you have a, Hewlett-Packard CPU unit, you know that there were thousands more exactly like it. And so in that sense, there's a kind of abstraction embedded in the object, which is distinct from the way in which I'm painting on it and treating it. And these e-waste works also, all of them have sort of what I think of as an A-B relationship, where there's one part in relationship to another, one thing in front and one thing hanging on the wall. And I think that's also a thread, that it's always about relationships inside of the work. So I'll stop sharing my screen. I know that was really fast. I just thought, given I have no idea really who I'm talking to and whether you know my work at all, that it was useful to have some images shared before we talk about it.
And we can always come back to them as needed.
Mm-hmm.
That was lovely, Jessica. It's always so great to have an overview, and especially, this is all very recent work, as you all probably gathered from kind of Utrecht on, right? Maybe let's start and go through as much as we can, but let's start with the curatorial piece, which I think is actually really nice to start with, because in this context, because I always think about, as an art historian, I always think of CA as like, oh, this is the Art History Association, but in fact, it is, of course, the Association for Art Historians and Artists, and lots of us involved in art. And the curatorial act, or curating as a practice, seems to be one that artists and art historians very much kind of, that's where we intersect a lot, at least in the contemporary field. And I've been fascinated by that work that you've been doing at that kind of seeming intersection between artistic practice and installation, and then the curatorial piece coming in as you have started working with other artists' works in collections. I think did you do that for the first time at the Tang Museum? Is that right?
The first time I did it was at Gorney Braven Lee Gallery. I had a show called Tabletop Sculpture, and I invited a lot of people in my life, friends, family, colleagues, students, former students, and people and artists who really mattered to me, who I'd never met, to kind of as a context. So you walked into the show, and there was this small show of small wall work that were part of a kind of situation, I called it, where there was chairs and couch and you could sit down. It made it sort of like almost a domestic setting in the gallery. And I was again thinking about the fact, that was like the first time I was thinking about the fact that my work doesn't exist alone. And I'm really invested in my autonomy as an artist. I don't, I like to collaborate here and there, but I'm also invested in the singular vision that's possible working alone, and feel like making art is a place where that privileges being aware of one's own agency. You have that opportunity alone in your studio. And there aren't so many places in our lives where that's actually underlined. But then as I got older, and continue to get older, fortunately, I become more and more aware of how utterly dependent my work is in so many ways on everybody around me, and on the history that comes before me, and the way in which thought is.
Yeah, and it seems like your work has always been about relationship between objects. So there's also a way in which these types of relationships become articulate. I mean, that's it. Curating is very much about setting objects in relationship with one another and having those relationships become meaningful in and of themselves, right? That's curating in some sense at its best.
Yeah.
There's a way in which you produce even new knowledge and new types of things, and you're producing new forms, new shapes, all sorts of new things in these juxtapositions. And I really appreciate and love how you have different types of relationships though going, like as your work in some sense has kind of exploded in scale and in terms of the types of objects that come into the work, it seems also there's a greater range of relationships between objects and between you and the objects and between your artwork as an installation and the object. So it seems like there are all these moments where it seems like a kind of very generous, loving, respectful, honoring embrace of other objects. There's the relationship of support. Sometimes there's some restraint coming in. Sometimes you're really changing an object. Like, I think it was a painting that you bought used somewhere, right? That you actually painted over in Utrecht. I find that very, very dramatic moment, right? Because as you said, you can't change the objects in the collection, but you can buy art and change it. That's very different than the kind of propping and support. And then there also seems to be, though, at certain moments, a kind of sense of appropriation. And again, you stress that it's a temporary thing. But those relationships, that seems really important to me, because that goes in some sense maybe a little bit against, or maybe that is what you mean with the sort of sense of an edge and a boundary, is that these relationships, there's a boundary that is crossed also, right? And it's a testing of the edges and the boundaries, where they begin and where they end. Does that sound right?
Well, like buying objects in the store, all of them are designed by somebody. There are people's intelligence and creativity that design these things, and most of the time we don't have names attached to them. So yeah. So what's the difference between that, using those materials, and I mean, I don't tell stories most of the time with the objects. I'm kind of aware of the cloud of significance that an object brings with it. I can look at, how it's made, who made it, where it was made. A lot of objects are sort of nostalgic for craft, the way it used to be. So they kind of quote, the way things were, and they aren't anymore. So things made of plastic are made to look like things that were made with other materials. And then I'm also interested in, making one's way through life. You can't be aware of everything. We just can't be. So I think that's part of why we're conscious. Consciousness edits our apprehensions, and we have to make use of things in the world. We can't be aware of everything. So in that sense, we become habit driven in terms of how we're seeing things. So when I use objects, I'm interested in, I kind of come at this from being a painter, and I love color and, sensuality and form, and how it moves one, which is harder to talk about. All of those parts of being human and making art and being interested in making something, I can find parts of an object that will serve this other function. And at the same time, I don't want to erase the other object most of the time. So I use the object kind of in those two ways. So I really care about this kind of cloud of different meanings that the object bring with them. But I turn it on its head often. And I also think about a lot of the things that we buy as being part of kits. Like it's obvious in at Home Depot, the 4x8 sheets of plywood, and the 8-foot 2x4s, and the 16-inch centers that you screw things into. So I'm, when you buy a lamp, a table lamp, it's made for a table. So the table is the other part of the kit. So I'm like taking all these pieces of things that were often meant for other purposes and kind of reassembling them with inventing a use for them that's distinct from their origin. So all of that I can do in my own work when I'm in the role of a curator, which I don't think I'm a proper curator. I've been invited to occupy the shoes a few times. When I'm in that role, I don't feel that I have that liberty with other people's work. But when I bought a work at the thrift store that has like no name, no provenance history attached to it, that's a kind of different story. And yeah, I mean, like, we collectively have decided that, you know, some work is valuable, and there are millions and millions of artworks that we don't decide are valuable, that are valuable to the people who make them, and valuable perhaps socially in a small community. But there's a certain painfulness in that too. I mean, where does all, you know, the world can't keep all the stuff we artists make. So.
Well, I mean, but it's always both to me. Like, and I really, I loved how you said, well, design objects are made by somebody too. Someone gave them thought. Someone made them in the way that they are, in very particular ways. In many cases, not always design is thoughtful, but there are ways in which you do take something away from an object. Maybe in many moments, you certainly take their functionality away. But you also always give something or highlight something. You bring aspects out, and that's of course always through color and always through form, and a way in which, you know, you bathe objects in colors. You bathe entire spaces in colors, and the viewer's experience as well. I mean, I often actually, especially in these curated environments that you've created, I very often think of Matisse's Red Studio, this idea of just color completely taking over the world. It's a really beautiful experience in person, of course, as well. So again, like, I think this emphasis on the relationship, what your attitude is towards object, to me is interesting. But I want to push that outward a little bit, given you're working in installation contexts, almost always, and given that in these exhibitions in Utrecht, I mean, you had the entire museum, and I so wish I had been able to see it. You know, you were on different floors, etc. It seems to me you had to think on a very different scale suddenly, in terms of these relationships you're creating, in terms of the spaces your work occupies, and more about architecture maybe than usual. So I'm curious what the role of architecture is and space is in relationship to the objects.
Well, when I work in my studio on objects and propose that they're autonomous, that's a word that's been attached to them, I'm assuming a certain kind of context that they can move into, a generic context. And the scale of exhibition spaces, galleries, and museums shifts a lot. So it's true for everybody's work who makes objects. Some kinds of architecture accommodate your work or this particular work better than other kinds of architecture, that more intimate spaces, sometimes for some work, and grand spaces for others. But essentially, there's a proposal that the work exists in a space, in an interior space. Making a work for an exterior space is a whole other story. And so I'm very focused on context all the time, whether it's a generic context or a specific one. The word installation for me, I've kind of used it to identify the works I make that are ephemeral for the most part, and responsive to particularities in architecture. So the work I shared at the Central Museum, that work, it couldn't be installed anywhere else. It's responsive to the up and down of that space, that that there are two staircases, that you look out the windows to other parts of the exhibition on two sides of that installation. It's made with stuff from the museum that belongs to the museum. It would never go anywhere else to be part of my installation. So that work is ephemeral and very specifically related to generally architecture. Often I've made works outdoors too, like the Color Jam piece I made in Chicago that involved an intersection and architecture, the intersection of two roads and the buildings next to the roads. But considering the architecture in relationship to designing a whole exhibition, that's like a really different kind of intersection with architecture. And the Utrecht that was a big stables. It was an old stable that was appended to an older kind of, I guess, it was a nunnery, I think. So you have this old stone, building, historic, and then you have stables. So the stables are often used there for invited shows, exhibitions, traveling shows. And so that was a long, thin space where one room moved into another, but it was entered through the old space, which is.
But there was also a different floor, right? Wasn't there this rope-like component that you made that wove up the stairs and through another story, and so connected, in some sense, connected all of these different spaces?
Yes, there were two of those upper floors, but there wasn't a continuous upper floor. They were like a small room up on top. And so, yes, it was like that. So, yeah, so I considered, kind of, and I organized the show by way of chapters. There were titles for each room, for each set of rooms. With that like one focused on paintings, realist paintings of things. And that was I really enjoyed that, because there's no, like, what's reality? Like, do photographs show us reality? And if you look at all these different realist paintings from different centuries, very different proposal for what reality is. So that I really enjoyed that. And next to something I made. And then there was the kind of design room with the Rietveld shelves and tables, and which also enters my work in relation to using designed objects. And there was another room that was kind of focused on light fixtures a little bit. So it was a kind of travel through. The OGR was also like a really particular architecture. There were these two shows. The invitation was to engage painting. The subject matter was painting. And how do you show paintings with no walls and no light? So my job was to propose a situation where that could happen, because a painting needs a wall. It has a particular relationship to architecture.
Something that Mies van der Rohe often forgot about when he designed museums, is that he needed some walls and maybe also protect from light.
Yes.
So I want to move on to the assist, because I love that body of work, and ask you to clarify, maybe for everyone, when you talk about the prop function of these objects that your art is attached to, and you say the props are not part of the artwork. And so often these props seem to be household items, furniture, refrigerator. And one of the things I love about those works, and actually also gesturing a little bit to thinking about the specific shapes and how you've talked about the color and how they can take different scales depending on what context someone might install a work in. It seems that with the assists, and this is with the way that the props function, if you were to install that work, you can install it prop, you can use a different prop, right?
Yes.
You don't have to put it on your refrigerator.
Yes.
So there seems to be a kind of step in towards allowing quite a significant amount of agency to the owner of an artwork, or to a viewer, or a museum where a piece might be, with the specific shapes as well. You want to talk a little bit about that, especially since you just talked about how you're aware of other people intersecting with your work, but in the end also you very much want to and do control your work.
Yeah, well, that's a good question. And I think the question of control is a question that's probably a pivotal question for everybody being alive. And certainly I think then again for all artworks, but it's a different question for people. People like run into it differently. We have all of, our unique relationship to caring about it, not caring about it, but we need to control things to survive, to some extent. And so, yeah, I mean, my work is very formal, I think, sometimes it appears maybe a little chaotic, but I'm interested in the way form intersects chaos and happenstance. And the work, I came from being a painter. I started as a painter and kind of became interested in the frame and transgressing the frame. and wondering about the frame and the inside and outside of it. And then the walls became interesting because paintings hang on walls, and then the wall frames the painting. And so a long kind of history in my work of being interested in the edge between the thing I'm making and the building in that regards. And there's you know, I really love what I've done that way. It's mattered to me a lot. Those questions matter to me a lot. But there's also a discomfort in the kind of, lack of control, the way in which, I mean, if you take my work and put it on a garbage heap, you might not recognize it as distinct from the garbage, you know, because the work needs the kind of clean space around it to frame it. So even though I'm edging on frames all the time and I'm breaking them, it nevertheless needs to be framed one way or another so people can see it. And so I can see it. And so the e-waste work was a way kind of trying to think about like making something autonomous, more autonomous, and the assist too. The assist is a thing. I mean, a painting, even if you have a framed painting, it needs a wall to hang on. And an assist, in the same way, the assist needs a prop. It's just not specified in the same way. It's not wall. It's not as generic. So it's the same idea, same conceptually very similar, but of course people expect paintings to hang on walls, and when they go buy a painting, they don't think they're buying the wall. You know, they expect that they have to supply a wall. And with the assists, even if you have a press release and you talk to people about the fact that it needs a prop and it's not the same prop all the time, takes a long time for people to get their head around it. So certainly when they walk into the gallery and they see one of my assists, they're not thinking that the prop is not part of the work. So it's an awkward idea. But
I think there's also a tremendous amount, and I think this runs through your work more generally as well, in an almost philosophical world. Like there's a faith in art with a capital A, and making one of these assists, there's a way in which you have faith in this artwork being art, however someone chooses to prop it. It's interesting that you mentioned, like, if it's next to a garbage heap, maybe it wouldn't hold up. I actually have the faith that it would hold up somehow. I think that that's really beautiful and uplifting somehow to have this faith in an artwork holding its own and remaining art in whatever kind of everyday world context it comes in. It's actually something, you know, thinking about not that many artists think about, and maybe because they can't control how their art might then enter into, I mean, we so often think about art entering museums, but so often art is in private homes as well. And I like that you think about that, even though you can't control it, that there's a way in which you build that fact, that afterlife of the work into the making of the work, in ways that we don't often see, I think. Wanted to come back to you talked about the writer, the piece in Utrecht outside, and the kind of, you know, working with historic art, and that was a monument outside. And I've been fascinated by the debate around monuments in the United States, especially, and how little we've actually invited artists to make temporary commissions and interventions like that. I'm curious, like, did you research the sculpture? Like, did that become part of your process of thinking about this, or you just reacted to it in a kind of visceral way, in a formal way, as you came across it? Like, I'm curious about the thought process of what it meant to work in a public space with a sculpture that probably meant a lot to people in that city, that you came in from the outside, and that kind of awareness of working with a historic object.
I was invited to make something for the Crusalon, it's called. It's a kind of road there near the train station with a median, big kind of grassy park-like median with, you know, road on both sides. And they were installing all of this sculpture at the same time. So it hadn't been there. It's not like the sculpture was sitting there for years and I came and did something to it.
I see.
So I was asking them what was in their collection that could serve this function. And so that's how I approached it. And I don't think that either of those sculptors are like really renowned. I don't think like they weren't revered in Utrecht or something, and I came and did something to them. They were kind of taken out of a city collection and
Okay,
hadn't been
completely
seen.
different.
Yeah. The other time I did something like that was in Mittelheim. I did a big outdoor installation in their sculpture park, and they have little outside sculpt. You know, when they're outside, they're little sculptures kind of scattered around in a park-like setting. And that I was invited. I could make an installation in that piece of the park or in the contemporary section. And I chose to make something in this classical section where these, you know, bronze cast sculptures were scattered around, and made my work in relationship to them. And they were all on concrete pedestals. And I made these big concrete posts that were part and parcel of my work that kind of resonated with those pedestals. I didn't touch the sculptures in the same way. And it was, again, it was temporary. So, and in that case, there were people in Mittelheim, I think, who did care for their experience of moving around these sculptures. And if that had been a permanent installation, they would have been really pissed off. And I think some of them found it a little irritating, you know, that their idyllic sculpture park was disturbed, but it was there for a few months and gone. And, you know, I think art is a place where things should get disturbed once in a while. And, but, you know, curating, you know, you recast things, you move things around, you compare things. The whole art making experience is one of asking questions about how things mean. And so, yeah, so I think a little disturbance is okay. Also, I mean, I do, you know, I grew up, you know, with modernism. And modernism, embedded in modernism, is a proposal. I'm just responding to what you said about art earlier. There's a proposal that it could be universal, that has been thoroughly attacked, you know, as I've grown. And you know, there's a big emphasis on, and for good reasons, you know, modern, you know, yes, but there are things about being human that are shared and universal, and then enormous numbers of things that aren't shared. And there are hierarchies and power structures and racism and colonialism. And, you know, there's all of these things are part of the world we're in. So I don't think there's a right and wrong answer in there. But my work is, my desire to make it stems from who I am and my personal relationship to this world that's complex. But I also think that when I make something and put it out there, it's no longer me. You know, you don't need to know my psychology and my reasons for making it for it to mean something in relationship to other things in the world and other things people made. So that's, you know, I think that part of, you know, intersecting collections and putting things in different contexts, there are always, and in objects too, there's always class, you know, money, questions of hierarchy in terms of what gets to be in a collection. There's, you know, politics and power, and so all of those things are always part and parcel of what's happening. I mean, I don't make objects out of gold and silver, you know, and if I was really, really rich, would I make objects out of gold and silver? I don't think so, but you know, you don't really know till you get to be something, whether, you know, what your choices are that way. I mean, I work within my means, my financial means, my physical means, my time, you know, capacities. And I think that's another piece of art making that's always really interesting. People always, you know, work, if you decide you're like driven to make some art for whatever reasons, you have to make decisions within, you know, limitations. And if you don't have any limitations, life gets perhaps a little harder, you know.
Yeah, no, that's a really nice observation, though I also would imagine it gets also hard equally, or equally interesting probably, is where you actually decide not to do something opportunities that may present themselves to an artist who is very successful like you are, because you can't do everything. And then having to choose and saying no to things. I don't know, maybe I'm imagining also quite a few students listening. I think just the saying no is very hard as
Yeah,
one becomes successful or more established, etc.
I think it's really especially hard when you're younger, when you're building your life and your career, and saying no, maybe no one will ever ask you again. So it's like you feel you get pressed to squeeze in more than you might want to do all at once to take advantage of opportunity. The art world's fickle. Yes. You never know what's going to come your way. So yeah, it's a little, but
it's a way of finding and articulating yourself, actually, both to work within limitations, but also to say no. It's interesting. There's a kind of parallel there. We should probably turn to questions, if there are any.
Yeah.
No question. Oh, yes. Okay. Yes, we have a big question. Yeah. The way the works explore edges and boundaries means that they are essentially contingent, conceptually as well as physically. Literally, they are attached to the works of other artists, architects, makers with other histories and functionalities apart from your interventions and the compositions you arrange. This makes me wonder about the way the installations and interventions come apart and together. Do you reuse components multiple times? If so, are they reused in the same arrangements multiple times or in different arrangements? Do you keep the components, or do they all return to different homes and collections and or into the landfill following an installation, or are they stored and reused? Also, can the components of your installation work that are made in the studio exist on their own as solitary sculpture apart from the purpose they serve in an installation?
Rarely does that happen. The work in the studio, I propose the works that I make here to be things that will have a continuing life, and they have very specific, often they're made in parts that have to be installed together, and there's very specific instructions that I make about how to install them. The installation work usually doesn't have another life, and I'm rarely attached to the material that I use to make the installation work. I guess to me, there's sort of like I'm not like I don't fetishize objects. I care about material, and I care about the multiplicity of effect that material can bring with it. And like I said before, meanings attached to it. But when I put together a bunch of material for an installation work, it's kind of like the parts all come together to make something that's completely distinct from the objects. The artwork in the end is distinct from all those objects. And in the end, I don't care to have the objects. I don't have attachment to material in that way. Did I answer all those questions?
Okay, so no other questions. I have another question, actually, maybe that gets us to the specific shapes. So you described a little bit, maybe you want to describe a little bit again how you've arrived at those shapes, because one of the things that I found interesting following your work for so long is how you started working with the computer, and in terms of coming up with these shapes, finding them, manipulating them, etc. And slightly maybe different, or development in the way that you're thinking about scale in relationship to working with the computer. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Well, I haven't spent the time to become really proficient, like with Photoshop or InDesign or something. I think to be really good at those programs, you have to use them all the time, and to just do it for like a couple of days and then do something else. I haven't found it in myself to kind of accumulate a great deal of skill there. But one of the really nice things about images digitally is that they can be so easily scaled. Before the computer, to shift the scale of an object or a drawing was an enormous venture. You know, you would have your little picture, to put a grid over it, have a bigger grid, and copy by hand. And, you know, like there weren't easy ways to shift scale. That's a huge change in the processing of information that, you know, has happened in our lifetimes. And so what I found myself doing is, well, I was looking for shapes, and I'm interested in the way in which the line that defines the shape defines both the inside and the outside. So like there'll be like incursions into the color. So the white of the wall the shape is on is as important to kind of pause a play with positive and negative space. So they're flat shapes. They're not like modulated color. So the edge is really important. It's a kind of a drawing. And so I was looking for shapes, and I'd first made photographs of myself. I had my husband kind of take pictures of me outside with the sun and shadows, and I took pictures of him. And then I realized, well, I could just Google shapes too. So I kind of Googled, Googled different animals and people and dancers and, cars. And then so I'm looking for shapes in relationship to stuff in the world and the in-between spaces. And so I get those on my laptop, and then I take a little piece of tracing paper and I can scale the shapes. I can you just use your fingers and make it bigger or smaller. And I can then draw fine shapes and put them together. So they're kind of conglomerations of shape taken from lots of different circumstances. And then I can photograph my drawings and put them in the computer. And then I can scale those too and retrace them and, mess with them and flip them. And so yeah, it's a really nice process because it's uses that capacity of the computer to scale things and duplicate them. But then I, with a pencil and paper, do the drawing, which seems to me much easier than, because also computers aren't really great at curves. Like you can't with a pencil, just make a curve, but computers have to plot it out in a really complicated way. So yeah, then I make those shapes, and then I have a digital projector, and I can project the shape on the wall, and I can make smaller ones or bigger ones. And it's sort of taken me full circle in a way, because I still make the object. And the object and the process of making the object is kind of an exploration and making use of stuff, a lot of hardware too. I really like hardware. And so I put together this object, which then has a relationship to the shape, and I kind of work on them together. So I start one and the other will, they can speak to each other. So I can make these small things and small objects that don't take lots of room to store. And then I can make a really huge shape. If I was invited to make something in a huge museum, the shape can be gigantic on the wall. So it's kind of like the installation work in that way, that I can take advantage of color and space and architecture, but it's a much more sustainable activity.
What's the owner and or curator's agency in making those shapes in a different space?
I suppose when they purchase,
is the scale decided by? Can it be decided by someone else? Because I know you have these drawings where the shape is on, and then you have the color as a control color on the piece of paper on the drawing as well. So to me, that implied that there's a way in which someone else can complete the work.
I specify, each one has kind of different specifications, but most of them have a specification that they can't be any smaller than a certain size. So, and the object needs to be hung kind of where paintings are hung in relationship to a person. The fixed object can't be 50 feet above the ground. It has to be where it can be experienced, but the shape can be. So the shapes can be really big. And then I specify the relationship the object has to the shape, like which part of the shape it gets hinged to, how they intersect. And I take account of the shiftings, the possibility of shifting scale for the shape. So, each one is different depending on how they go together.
Okay. I mean, in another way, I feel like those pieces disentangle a really key dynamic and long-standing dynamic in your work, which is actually about combining. I don't know, that there's a way in which you combine different scales, and so much of the power of your work comes from combining things that are very small and intricate, and then adding a large color shapes and connecting them to something that is much bigger. And one constantly has to shift one's mode of attention and mode of viewing actually in your work. And there's a way in which these pieces bring that out, that juxtaposition, in a very concentrated way. They're almost, I don't know, they're almost comments on your work, like they're a weird way, a kind of crystallization of your work in that sense as well. Which I think
thank you. I think that's really beautifully said.
I'm seeing again Elizabeth Hoffman raising her hand.
I am back. I'm sorry I missed you last time.
That's okay. Go for it.
Okay. First I want to say, Jessica, I love your shapes. I think they're great. I love the colors. I love the shapes. I think they're great. And I urge you, if you find Photoshop to be too cumbersome, I also find it is, because for the same reason, I leave it for a couple of weeks and then I've forgotten how to use the darn thing. But I understand that Google and other people are going to make easier things to use, and even on your phone. So and secondly, I wondering if you've given much thought to Jeff Koons and his rabbit, because he was in a big court case, over that rabbit, which he probably got at the 99-cent store. And he, someone designed it and they sued him, for making that rabbit into an aluminum thing. And it was a big, multi-million-dollar lawsuit or something. Anyway, and the third question, and the most important question I have to ask you is, if you've ever, I really like your transition from 2 dimensions to 3. And I think that's a really hard thing to do. Many people can't, if they can do 2 dimensions, they can't do 3 dimensions. But I'm wondering if you think of your space as theatrical space, and like because you talk a lot about sort of breaking the mold about the white box, like Peter Brooks or something. And I'm wondering if you've given much thought to yourself as a theatrical person.
All good questions. The Koons thing, yes, is interesting. I think I'd have to become a much more expensive artist for anybody to want to sue me. But also, I'm not copying other people's objects. I'm actually using the object. So that's an interesting difference. Copyright law is really complicated, and I can sort of feel both sides of it. If you have your work taken from you and somebody else is making hundreds of thousands of dollars off of it and you aren't, of course, you're kind of be pissed. On the other hand, I think that, we make things as artists and we copy each other and quote each other. Like, what's the difference between a copy and a quote? We quote each other and refer to each other in the work all the time. So yeah, that's really complicated. Yes, I've thought about it. But it's fortunately not a problem for me at the moment. And the question of theatricality, yeah, I've spent a lot of time thinking about that. The Michael Fried piece, Art and Objecthood, where he rants and rails against theatricality. I think that's a beautiful piece of writing, and I have a lot of feeling for him and his upset with the way in which art became theatrical. And I don't see myself as an actor. I tend not to be on the stage that I create very much. But I make things that operate in that space of theatricality. And on the other hand, I also, I don't see myself as making environments. You know, I don't like take a room and ask you to forget that you walked into the room. I'm really interested in having the work create a kind of fictive sense of, you know, a feeling space that kind of could be understood to be fictive. And I kind of like to kind of break the bubble of the fiction that we call reality. I mean, if you make a room and you cover all the plumbing and wiring up with sheetrock and paint the wall a certain color and, you know, call that the real room, like what's the difference between that real room and, you know, something else that you put on the wall? So my work is kind of like, you know, yes, it has theatrical moments. I've also made a lot of platforms, things that people walk on, kind of referred to kind of directly and indirectly to stage. And yes, so I think about those things a lot.
I think you do it very well. I'm very, you got me thinking a lot. For instance, I had a friend in school, and for her final BFA exhibition, she crocheted a whole piece that covered this David Smith sculpture, and I didn't really understand it until your talk today.
Thank you. Thanks for the questions too.
Do we have any other questions, Jacqueline? Otherwise, I have one more, and then I know we probably
I think let's hear from you. It's one more.
Okay, and we have just only 2 more minutes, I think. So one closing question. Whew, pressure's on. Maybe just because I would hate not to get to the last group of works that you showed, Jessica, the e-waste. It's such a surprising term for you to think about waste, and you mentioned earlier maybe your work wouldn't hold up in relationship to waste, because always the way that you use objects. I was saying earlier that it's always a very exuberant, positive, loving, respectful relationship. It's never this is waste, and yet, with this e-waste, there is, of course, that connotation of these objects are no longer in use, and you're taking away a major part of their identity. So I wanted you to talk a little bit more about that notion of waste.
Well, you know, I think we all feel this kind of pain these days of like the awareness of the unsustainability of what we're engaged in our relationship to material. This huge flow of stuff that we all buy, and most of it doesn't last very long, and it ends up on the dump. And if you buy things online and return them, you now hear that most of them get thrown away. And so, and I think like human nature is to be involved in material. We care about material transformation, which is part of making art. And I think also like about magpies, you know, who are attracted to bright, shiny things. Well, I am, and people are, and we, you know, it's our nature. So I think in my work, I'm like, you know, I accept the nature of who I am and who we are. I'm not like, you can't just judge it away, like, oh, none of us care about buying things anymore. It's just not going to happen like that. We have to embrace who we are and what makes us happy and the sensuality that we care about. It's a little bit painful, you know, the spot we're in relationship to our material existence. So it's part of what I think making my work over the years, my care for material and making things has taken me to thinking about those things and having feelings about them. And also kind of in the end, what do we value? Like, do we value the thing forever and ever unchanging and fixed in time? Or do we value, it's a flow, like we exist in time, and making art and making abstractions is a way to propose that things will exist through time, so that we have a big effort to carry our thinking and our cares through time. But we also have to, it's the way I think about it, it's also just a processing of energy. You're alive, you have energy. I make things, I share them with people if I'm lucky, and I have been lucky to share things with people. And whether they're in the end part of a flow of waste, or they get kept for 25 years or 100 years, or or not, they get thrown away, that's a kind of another question. So yeah, we could talk even longer about it, but we can't.
Yeah, we can't. Yeah. But that's a beautiful way to end, and I'll just leave it and close maybe by citing Catherine Desjardins to everyone: magpie marvelous.
Well,
so thank you, Jessica. This was really wonderful. I wish we had another hour.
And thank you,
thank you
Christine.
everybody for organizing and for joining.